She sat in seat 1A like she owned the plane, because she did, but no one knew that yet. What happened next shocked every passenger, exposed a deep-rooted bias, and ended with handcuffs, gasps, and a career destroyed. You think you've seen power shifts before? Think again. This isn't just a flight, it's a wake-up call. Buckle up, because what you're about to witness will leave you speechless. They all assumed she didn't belong. From the moment Maya Bennett stepped onto the plane, the air shifted. Not for her, but around her. It was the kind of quiet shift that went unnoticed if you weren't the one it targeted. Most passengers were busy scrolling through their phones or settling into wide leather seats, some smiling as flight attendants offered them champagne, and polite conversation. None of them paid attention to the woman in the navy blazer who walked in without fanfare and sat down in the front cabin. None of them knew her name. But Deborah Klein noticed. Deborah, the lead flight attendant, had a knack for sorting people the second she saw them. She was proud of it, her silent assessments, her cold efficiency. She had rules, unwritten ones, carved over years of service in luxury. Maya didn't fit the mold. There was something about her stillness, her quiet presence, that rubbed Deborah the wrong way. She watched Maya walk past the welcome mat without flinching, bypass the small talk, and settle into seat 1A as if it had always been hers. Deborah didn't like that. She greeted the next passengers, an elderly couple with familiar faces and warm smiles with practiced charm. Her voice lifted an octave, her eyes sparkled with rehearsed delight. "Lovely to see you again." When she passed Maya's row, the warmth vanished. No welcome, no eye contact, no offer of help, just silence, heavy and deliberate. The cabin filled slowly. The flight was nearly full. A woman in pearls whispered something to her husband while glancing sideways. A young man in a tailored suit took the seat across the aisle and opened his laptop, only pausing briefly when he noticed the tension near the front. Deborah hadn't said anything yet, but everyone could feel it building. She approached, finally, not with curiosity, but with the weight of assumption. Her voice was tight and polite on the surface, but every syllable was lined with something else. "I believe you're in the wrong section." Maya looked up calmly. "This is my seat." There was no defensiveness in her tone, no explanation offered, just a statement of fact. But Deborah didn't accept it. She didn't ask for a boarding pass. She didn't double-check the list. She simply shook her head and repeated herself, louder this time, as if the volume might change the truth. "This section is reserved for elite passengers." A few heads turned. The pearl-wearing woman leaned forward just a little. The businessman across the aisle glanced sideways, a frown beginning to form. "I suggest you move to the back before we take off." Maya didn't move. That's when Deborah crossed her arms. That's when her voice rose. That's when the mask of professionalism slipped just enough for the disdain to show. "If you don't cooperate, I'll have to involve security." Still, Maya didn't move. The junior flight attendant, Sarah, stood nearby, her posture hesitant. She looked between the two women, unsure whether to speak. Her eyes landed on Maya's name printed clearly on the manifest attached near the cockpit. It was right there. But she stayed quiet. Deborah didn't leave room for dissent. "If she wants trouble, she's going to get it," Deborah muttered under her breath. But the thing about trouble, it doesn't always show up the way you expect. The silence that followed was thick. Passengers watched, not knowing what to do. Some avoided eye contact altogether, others whispered. There was the rustle of discomfort, the shifting of perspectives. The tension had moved from subtle to tangible, and yet Maya stayed still, her voice low, her presence steady. She didn't demand respect. She didn't beg for understanding. She didn't justify her presence in that seat, and in doing so, she made it clear she didn't need to. What unsettled Deborah most wasn't Maya's defiance. It was her calm. And that's when Deborah made a choice. Not to check the list, not to ask for clarification, not to walk away. She chose escalation. Sarah hesitated again, almost stepping forward, almost saying what she knew to be true. But the moment passed. Deborah waved her off and turned back to Maya, voice loud enough now for everyone to hear. "This is your last warning." People leaned in. The whispers turned sharper. Some passengers, uncertain, began to side with Deborah. Others simply watched, measuring Maya's reaction, wondering why she didn't just move. Maybe they assumed she had made a mistake. Maybe they thought she was trying to sneak into a better seat. Maybe, like Deborah, they had already decided who Maya was. That's how these things go. Quiet judgments, instant conclusions. But Maya wasn't there to prove anything. Not yet. She picked up her phone, one short message sent, then silence again. She didn't shout, she didn't cry, she didn't fold. She just waited. And that silence said more than anything she could have spoken. Deborah returned to her duties with a clipped pace and a forced composure, but the weight of what had just unfolded clung to the cabin like static. Passengers whispered behind raised hands, casting side glances toward seat 1A. Sarah resumed her position near the galley, stealing quick looks at Maya as if waiting for something, anything, to break the silence. But Maya didn't move. She didn't speak. She didn't chase down explanations or force a confrontation. She simply remained where she was, still and unshaken, as though the moment had passed and she had already filed it away. Deborah, on the other hand, simmered. She carried a tray of bottled water through the aisle, her movements sharp, her gaze fixed on tasks that no longer held her full attention. She paused near the Raymonds, offering a bright smile and a gentle tone. "Would you like something to drink?" Mrs. Raymond declined with a small nod, already threading yarn through her knitting needles. Mr. Raymond barely glanced up from his newspaper. Satisfied, Deborah continued her route, passing passengers she considered deserving. The socialite in pearls accepted a bottle, thanking her with a perfumed smile. The young man across the aisle took one without comment. Then came Maya. Deborah reached her row, met her eyes for half a second, then kept walking. The tray tilted slightly as she turned, the last 2 bottles left untouched. Maya waited a moment, then, in a voice quiet but clear, asked for water. Deborah didn't stop. "I'll get to you when I can." There was no urgency in her tone, no intent to return. Maya said nothing in response. She shifted slightly in her seat, glancing down the aisle, then back at her phone. The hum of the engines filled the silence, broken only by occasional laughter, the clink of glass, the sound of fingers scrolling through screens. Time passed. Sarah reappeared, moving through the cabin with measured grace. She paused near Maya's row, offered a hesitant glance, but said nothing. Her lips pressed into a line, her hands clenched at her sides. A few rows behind, a passenger stood to stretch. Deborah returned with the now nearly empty tray. She moved past Maya once again, catching the edge of her leg in the aisle. She didn't slow down. She didn't look back. The tray tilted forward. A small cascade of water splashed across Maya's lap and onto the floor. Deborah gasped loudly, "Watch where you're putting your legs." Every head turned. The businessman across the aisle stiffened. The pearl-wearing socialite let out a soft, theatrical gasp. Sarah froze. Maya looked down at her soaked trousers, then up at Deborah. Her words were calm. "You walked into my leg." Deborah stepped back, her expression sharp. "You caused a mess." Maya's voice was even. "I've only asked to be treated with the same respect as everyone else. If that's too much to ask, then maybe you're the one who doesn't belong here." The statement landed with precision. No one spoke. No one moved. Deborah's expression tightened. Her hands clenched at her sides. She took a single step forward and, without a word of warning, raised her hand and struck Maya across the face. The sound echoed through the cabin like a dropped glass in a quiet room. Everything stopped. Gasps rippled through the rows. The businessman half rose from his seat, stunned. Sarah's hand flew to her mouth. Even the socialite stared, her previous intrigue replaced by wide-eyed disbelief. Maya didn't flinch. She sat upright, unmoving. Deborah stared back, chest heaving, eyes searching for validation that didn't come. No one applauded. No one agreed. Silence swallowed the cabin. Then Maya spoke. "You just made the worst mistake of your life." It wasn't a threat. It wasn't a warning. It was the truth. Deborah stepped back, blinking as if the room had shifted beneath her feet. Sarah remained rooted near the galley, her hands trembling. She turned, slowly, reached for the passenger manifest, and scanned it. Her finger stopped halfway down the page. There it was. Maya Bennett. Seat 1A. Sarah opened her mouth, but the words caught. Deborah caught sight of her movement. "What are you doing?" Sarah hesitated. "I've got this under control." The words cut through her hesitation. Sarah lowered the clipboard. The businessman finally spoke. His voice was calm but firm. "Is everything all right?" Maya nodded once. "I'm fine." Deborah spun on him. "I'd appreciate it if you didn't encourage the disturbance." He didn't blink. From where I'm sitting, you're the one making a scene. Deborah's composure unraveled further. Either she moves or she's escorted off this plane. Maya didn't answer. She didn't argue. She didn't rise to the bait. She simply straightened in her seat. You can try. That's when Deborah faltered. For the first time, uncertainty crept into her eyes. She turned without another word and walked away, her pace quick, her grip tight on the tray. Passengers watched her go, some stunned, some silent, others filled with a sense of something shifting. The hierarchy that once governed the cabin had cracked. No one knew what would happen next. But Maya did. Deborah didn't return right away. She disappeared behind the curtain that divided the galley from the cabin, leaving behind a trail of unsettled silence. Passengers leaned back into their seats, some pretending nothing had happened, others watching seat 1A like it held the answer to something they hadn't yet understood. The atmosphere was no longer just tense. It had become a waiting room for consequence. Maya remained still. Time passed slowly. The quiet returned. But it wasn't the same kind of quiet as before. This one was heavy, a presence in itself. Sarah walked through the aisle once more, stopping near the front to distribute fresh drinks. She hesitated as she reached Maya's row, glancing down at the empty glass still sitting on the tray table. Maya didn't ask again. The tray passed her by. Deborah returned with forced composure and a mask of professionalism, but something had shifted behind her eyes. She walked with a purpose that felt brittle, as if she were holding something together that was already falling apart. She stopped near Maya's seat once more, eyes narrowing. She gestured toward the aisle. You're not supposed to be here. Her voice had lost its sharpness. It cracked at the edges, but she pushed forward. Maya didn't respond. Passengers nearby watched closely. No one spoke, but the collective attention had sharpened. The woman in pearls looked around nervously. The businessman leaned slightly forward, hands clasped, waiting. Deborah turned to Sarah again, snapping her name like a command. Sarah paused, her eyes darting to the manifest still clipped by the cockpit. She stepped toward it. Her fingers hovered above the list, tracing down until she found the name again. She didn't need to read it. She'd already memorized it. But before she could speak, Deborah's voice cut through. What are you doing? I was just checking. I told you I have it under control. Sarah stepped back, her words silenced before they reached her lips. The atmosphere grew thicker. Maya hadn't moved since the slap. She hadn't adjusted, hadn't reacted, hadn't demanded. And in that stillness, she reclaimed the entire room. No retaliation, no spectacle, just presence. Unshaken, undeniable. It was this, her refusal to break, that stirred something unfamiliar in Deborah. The silence no longer protected her. It exposed her. A voice came from behind Maya's row, a quiet, measured tone. Is everything okay? The businessman again. Maya acknowledged him with a small nod. It was enough. Deborah turned on him again, voice sharp. She's causing a scene. He didn't flinch. You are. The words, though few, landed hard. Deborah's expression shifted. Her face, once steeled with authority, began to fray. Her next move came fast and without thought. She leaned in, voice rising again. Why don't you just admit you're in the wrong seat and stop wasting everyone's time? No answer. Maya's silence grew louder than any accusation. Passengers turned, waiting for Deborah to act or retreat or break. Instead, she turned again, marching down the aisle with a kind of energy that tried to mimic confidence but failed. She picked up a new tray, this time filled with glasses of water, and returned. Maya hadn't moved. Deborah approached the front once more. Maya had shifted slightly, one leg stretched just slightly into the aisle as one does when trying to find comfort in a long wait. Deborah's eyes caught it, and without slowing, she adjusted her route, letting her foot land directly into Maya's extended leg. The tray tilted, water splashed, glasses fell. A small mess, a loud gesture. Deborah gasped, performative and rehearsed. Watch where you're putting your legs. The accusation rang false. Maya looked down, then up. You walked into my leg. Her voice was steady, nearly soft, but it carried the weight of the moment. I've only asked to be treated with the same respect as everyone else. If that's too much to ask, maybe you're the one who doesn't belong here. The entire cabin froze. Deborah's face hardened. Then she stepped closer, words low, brittle, shaking. You think you can talk to me like that? Then came the final act. Without warning, without pause, Deborah struck Maya again, this time louder, harder, public. The sound cracked through the cabin. Gasps followed. Shock moved through the rows like turbulence. The businessmen stood halfway. Sarah's mouth fell open. Even the woman in pearls was silent now. Maya sat still. Deborah's chest rose and fell, but no one was with her anymore. The authority she had wielded for so long had slipped from her grasp. What had once been whispers of uncertainty had become certainty itself. Maya straightened, her voice low but clear. "You just made the worst mistake of your life." No reaction came from Deborah. Her breathing quickened. Her eyes moved from face to face, searching for support, for someone to nod, to validate, to join her. No one did. Sarah took a single step backward, then turned away. She disappeared behind the curtain. Her fingers trembled as she pulled out her phone. She dialed a number, her voice hushed but resolute. "It's Sarah. We have a situation." She hung up and returned to her post. Deborah remained by Maya's row, arms crossed, face tight with frustration, but her power was unraveling in real time. Nothing else needed to be said. The next move no longer belonged to her. The cabin held its breath. Deborah stood rooted beside Maya's seat, arms folded, gaze flickering across the faces that once looked past her but now stared back, wide-eyed and alert. She had lost control. That much was clear. But she didn't leave. Not yet. Her stance hardened, as if sheer stubbornness could reverse what had already been done. Maya didn't engage. She didn't flinch. She didn't rise. She stayed. Somewhere near the back, a murmur started. A middle-aged woman whispered to her travel companion, something about lawsuits and cameras. A man 2 rows back lifted his phone, subtly angling it toward the front. The businessman remained halfway upright, watching like a judge in a courtroom that hadn't yet declared a verdict. Then came the footsteps, heavy, purposeful, moving through the narrow aisle from the cockpit. The pilot emerged, his face pale and tight. He said nothing at first. His eyes swept the cabin. Then he turned toward Deborah with the kind of gaze that demanded stillness. "You need to step aside," he said, his voice calm but immovable. Deborah blinked. "Excuse me?" "I've just received word from headquarters," he said, now facing the cabin as if delivering news to an audience. "The owner of this aircraft is on board." Confusion flickered through the rows. Deborah's arms dropped slightly. Then the pilot turned toward Maya and nodded. "It's her." The words detonated silently. No raised voices, no dramatic music, just gasps, audible disbelief from nearly every row. The pearl-wearing woman's hand flew to her mouth. The businessman leaned back, lips parting just slightly in realization. Sarah, near the galley, froze mid-motion. Maya looked up, not to correct, not to confirm. She didn't have to. She had already told them. Just not with words. 2 sharply dressed assistants appeared behind the pilot, stepping onto the aircraft from a black SUV now visible through the small windows. They moved with precision, their presence subtle but undeniable. One of them addressed her with quiet respect, offering updates, a schedule, next steps. Deborah didn't move. Her skin turned several shades paler. Her mouth opened, closed, opened again. She searched the faces of the passengers for something. Sympathy, maybe. Understanding. But all she found was distance. Then Maya stood. Her voice carried no edge, no fury, only authority. She introduced herself, not as a defense, not as an explanation, but as a fact. She was Maya Bennett, owner of the aircraft, and also owner of the entire airline. The silence that followed was filled with a new kind of weight. Deborah stared at her like someone looking at the edge of a cliff, only now realizing she'd been walking blindfolded. Maya turned toward her, her words deliberate and razor-sharp. Deborah's behavior, she said, was disgraceful. The assumptions, the dismissal, the aggression, the public humiliation, none of it reflected the values she had built her company on. None of it would be tolerated. Deborah tried to speak. "I didn't know." Maya raised a hand, not to strike, not to silence, just to stop the excuses before they could turn into performance. "You didn't know," she said, "because you didn't care to find out." Deborah's shoulders sagged, her words dissolving into the air between them. No one defended her, not the passengers, not the crew. Even Sarah stood quiet, eyes down, hands folded, as if holding the weight of all the silence she'd kept too long. Then Maya turned to the pilot. "This needs to be addressed. Immediately." He nodded. "Understood." Deborah stepped back instinctively, already trying to make her way down the aisle toward an exit that didn't yet exist. The pilot blocked her path. "You're not going anywhere." She stopped. Maya's voice remained steady. You're unfit for this position. Effective immediately. You're fired. The words struck without force, but with finality. Deborah didn't argue. Not this time. The defiance had drained from her like light from a fading screen. Then came the officers. 2 uniformed police boarded the plane. One of them stepped forward, his tone respectful. We received the report. Are you pressing charges? Maya didn't hesitate. Yes. She assaulted me in front of multiple witnesses. I expect accountability. Deborah gasped. It was a misunderstanding. The officer didn't entertain it. He stepped closer. Ma'am, you're under arrest for assault. As the cuffs clicked behind her, the cabin watched in complete silence. Phones recorded, mouths stayed shut. The same woman who had strutted down the aisle minutes ago now disappeared through it with her head low and future fractured. No applause followed, only Maya's voice. To everyone here, I apologize for what you had to witness today. This is not the standard of service I expect on my planes. From this moment forward, we'll ensure every passenger is treated with the dignity they deserve. That was when the clapping started. A ripple at first, then a wave. The businessman joined. The woman in pearls. Even Mrs. Raymond paused her knitting. Maya turned to Sarah. I saw you hesitate, but you knew. You tried. Thank you. Sarah nodded, her eyes wide, her voice barely audible. You'll be hearing from my office about a promotion. The tension didn't disappear. It transformed. Relief filled the space where anger had been. Respect replaced silence. Maya stepped toward the exit, her assistants beside her. The air behind her forever changed. The plane touched down without fanfare, its descent smooth, mechanical, final. Passengers remained seated, some watching through the windows as a sleek black SUV pulled up directly beside the aircraft. The engines hadn't even cooled when 2 assistants stepped out, flanking the vehicle with crisp movements, their suits sharp, their focus singular. Inside the cabin, no one moved. Maya stood first. Her blazer was now dry, her voice was unchanged. The assistants boarded, greeting her with deference and calm. They handed her a digital tablet, briefed her quietly, adjusted nothing. Everything was ready. Everything had been waiting. Deborah was gone. Her absence filled the space like a storm that had passed but left the damage behind. The seat she once occupied at the front of the plane remained vacant, as if the fabric itself refused to remember her. Maya didn't linger. She turned toward the cabin one last time. Her voice reached every row, not by force, but by intention. My name is Maya Bennett. I'm the owner of this aircraft and the owner of this airline. What happened today will not be buried. It will be remembered, it will be corrected, and it will not be repeated. There was no resistance, no rebuttal, no sound at all, until a single clap broke the silence, then another. Within seconds, the cabin filled with applause. It wasn't celebration. It was recognition, an acknowledgement that something had shifted. A structure had been cracked and light had broken through. Mr. Raymond lowered his newspaper and gave her a quiet nod. Mrs. Raymond, for the first time in the entire flight, set her knitting aside and joined in. The businessman remained seated but pressed his hands together once, firmly, deliberately. Sarah clapped too, slowly, as if letting herself believe that what had just happened was real. Maya turned to her assistant, nodded once, and stepped off the plane. The SUV door opened as she approached. The tarmac felt quiet, grounded, certain. She entered without a word. The doors shut. The vehicle pulled away. But the story didn't end there. The video footage circulated within hours. Multiple passengers had recorded the moment Deborah raised her hand, the moment she refused to check the list, the moment Maya spoke her name. Clips flooded timelines and news feeds, each captioned with disbelief, rage, admiration. No one knew what was coming when they boarded that plane. They knew now. Television anchors debated it. Comment sections exploded. Politicians tweeted support. Activists dissected the silence in the cabin, the long pause between the first insult and the final revelation. They talked about race, about class, about how easily power morphs into prejudice when no one is watching, and how rare it is for someone to hold the mirror up before the damage multiplies. Maya didn't release a statement immediately. She waited. Then, days later, she sat in front of a live camera, framed by a neutral background, no logo behind her, no branding in sight. She wore the same navy blazer. Her words were simple. Respect is not earned by appearances. It is not a prize. It is a right. The clip went viral before the interview even ended. She spoke about what happened, but only briefly. Her focus was forward. She announced new policy changes, diversity audits, mandatory training programs, anonymous feedback systems for passengers and crew, structural protections, not performative ones. She didn't mention Deborah by name. She didn't need to. The narrative was no longer about one woman's mistake. It had grown beyond that. Maya ended the interview with a question. What kind of world do we want to board? It wasn't rhetorical. It was a challenge. Weeks later, on another flight, different city, different route, Maya boarded again. The crew knew who she was, but the greeting was warm, not rehearsed, genuine, not performative. The lead attendant smiled, offered her a drink, showed her to her seat. There was no tension, no doubt. The passengers didn't stare. Some recognized her, some didn't. It didn't matter. She settled into her seat, looked out the window as the runway blurred, and allowed herself one moment, just one, to exhale. This wasn't about revenge. It was about repair, and the work had only just begun. The story didn't fade. Instead, it embedded itself in conversations across offices, classrooms, boardrooms, dinner tables. What happened on that flight became more than an incident. It became a mirror. Not for Maya, but for everyone who watched and saw something too familiar. A glance dismissed, a voice ignored, a name doubted. People replayed the footage, not for shock, but for recognition. They knew what it was to be unseen. They knew what it meant to be mistaken for less. Maya said little in the days that followed. She didn't need to. Every platform carried her message. News outlets ran it alongside footage of Deborah being led away in handcuffs. Editorials followed. Essays appeared. Former employees from other airlines began speaking out, naming the small daily degradations that had long been normalized in the industry. For once, they weren't dismissed. The world was listening now. Maya's inbox overflowed. Letters came in from strangers, teenagers, veterans, retired teachers, single parents, each with a version of the same sentence, "I saw myself in you." Some of the messages were heartbreaking, others burned with quiet rage. A few were simply grateful, but none of them asked her to save them. They just needed someone to prove it could be done. Inside the airline, change moved quickly, not just in PR statements or neatly worded emails, but in operations. Hiring panels were restructured. Anonymous feedback from crew members began flowing into leadership with direct escalation channels. Flight staff were retrained, not in scripts, but in awareness. Listening became a metric, and respect was no longer treated as a courtesy, but as protocol. It wasn't perfect. No system is, but it was progress, and that mattered. Maya met with her executive team behind closed doors. There were no photo ops, no token apologies. She asked hard questions, demanded honest data, and made it clear. Image without substance was nothing. The culture had to shift, or the company would. Not everyone agreed with her pace. A few board members pushed back quietly, but they were outnumbered. She had seen the rot. She wasn't going to let it fester. 1 week after the incident, Maya made an unscheduled appearance at a staff town hall. No announcement, no fanfare, just presence. Some jaws dropped, others straightened in their seats. She took the microphone and said 5 words. "This isn't about one person." Then she told them what it was about. Every eye stayed on her. No one checked their phone, no one whispered. And when she finished, the room didn't erupt into applause. It held still, it absorbed, because what she gave them wasn't a performance. It was a reckoning. Later that afternoon, Maya walked through one of the airline's regional hubs, unannounced, no assistants, no cameras. She stopped to speak with the baggage handlers, the ground crew, the gate agents. No speeches, just questions. And when they answered, she listened. Some of them hadn't known who she was. Now they wouldn't forget. That night, she sat alone in her office, the city humming beyond the windows. She read 3 more letters, one from a woman in Georgia whose daughter had been kicked off a train for asking a question too confidently. One from a nurse in Colorado who had been mistaken for a janitor in her own hospital. One from a pilot who'd never flown first class because no one ever assumed he was the captain. She replied to each of them, not with platitudes, but with acknowledgement. And then she got to work again. Because the truth is, it was never just about a seat or a slap or even an apology. It was about the space between power and assumption and what happens when someone refuses to shrink. Maya had refused, and the world had shifted, even if only slightly. It would shift again. Months passed, but the echoes of that day didn't fade. If anything, they deepened. rippling outward into corners of the industry that had long gone untouched. Maya didn't chase headlines. She didn't need to. The story had already cemented itself into the cultural conversation, not because it was sensational, but because it was familiar, because it felt lived. People began telling their own versions. Stories about elevators, lobbies, classrooms, sidewalks, jobs they didn't get, assumptions they didn't challenge. Some were quiet, some were loud, but all of them carried the same thread: dignity delayed, dignity reclaimed. Maya kept moving. Her team expanded, not in number, but in purpose. She hired differently, promoted differently. She built systems that didn't just detect bias, they dismantled it. She sat in on interviews, not as CEO, but as observer. She asked why, over and over. Why this candidate? Why that tone? Why those words? She wasn't punishing. She was auditing. And through it, she was building a language that others could use, one that named things for what they were, without apology. In board meetings, she was quiet at first, but when she spoke, people listened, not because she demanded it, but because the weight of what she carried couldn't be ignored. Her presence became a kind of metric. If Maya paused, so did the room. If she asked a question, it lingered. One afternoon, she visited a training session for new recruits. They didn't recognize her at first, just another woman in the back of the room, taking notes. The instructor fumbled when he realized who she was. Maya just nodded and asked him to keep going. After the session ended, she stayed behind and answered questions, not as a symbol, not as a myth, but as someone who had once sat in their place and understood how quickly judgment arrives before truth. She didn't mention Deborah again. Not publicly, not privately. She had made her decision, she had enforced the boundary, and then she had moved forward. Not in denial, but in discipline. The airline changed. So did others. Competitors adopted similar reforms, not out of goodwill, but out of necessity. The market had shifted, passengers were paying attention, social media had become the new accountability, and silence the new liability. But Maya never let the momentum become a trend. She made sure it became structure. Then came the letter. It arrived late one evening, handwritten, no return address, just a folded note, pressed into a cream-colored envelope. Maya opened it slowly. There were only a few lines. It was from the woman in pearls. She didn't name herself. She didn't offer excuses. She simply wrote that she had watched and she had learned and she had changed. She wrote about her daughter who had asked why no one helped. She wrote about how that question stayed with her. She wrote that she now sees the world in frames she hadn't considered before, and that she's trying. Maya placed the letter in the drawer beside her desk, not because it erased anything, not because it fixed what was broken, but because it mattered. Not everyone would apologize, but someone did. The world outside kept turning. Flights came and went, planes lifted off and landed, passengers boarded and disembarked. Most unaware of the policy changes guiding every interaction, the layers of training behind every smile, the quiet vigilance behind every act of service, Maya stayed mostly behind the scenes. But every so often, she flew. She didn't announce herself. She didn't travel with an entourage. She boarded like anyone else. And the crews, newer now, younger, more diverse, greeted her with calm, professional warmth. Sometimes they knew who she was. Sometimes they didn't. It didn't matter. Respect wasn't about recognition anymore. One late autumn morning, Maya boarded a short flight headed west. The aircraft was smaller than the one from before. No first class, no curtain, just rows of seats, evenly spaced, humbly lit. She sat near the front, tucked away beside a window streaked with early frost. Across the aisle, a little boy looked up at her, curious but shy. His mother handed him a coloring book and adjusted his backpack beneath the seat. Maya smiled gently, nodding once, and turned her gaze back outside. The engines roared, the runway blurred, the sky opened. As the plane climbed, she thought about everything that had come before. The voices, the silence, the decisions, the aftermath. Not with regret, not with triumph, but with clarity. She thought about what it meant to hold a line, to stay seated when the world tells you to move, to speak softly when others raise their voices, to answer injustice not with vengeance, but with structure. Not everyone gets the chance, but when you do, you take it. You build from it. You give others room to stand too. And as the clouds thickened beneath the wings, Maya sat steady in her seat, knowing this wasn't just a flight. It was the proof that sometimes the most radical thing a person can do is refuse to disappear. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to today's story. Your presence means more than words can express. Stories like this are not just about individuals, they're reflections of the world we live in and reminders of the strength it takes to stand firm in the face of injustice. We hope it sparked something in you, whether it was a new perspective, a sense of recognition, or a quiet moment of reflection. If this story moved you, the best way to support our channel is simple. Just hit the like button. Leave a comment below to let us know which country you're watching from and how the story made you feel. Your voice adds depth to this space, and we truly want to hear from you. And if you haven't yet, please don't forget to subscribe. Every click, every comment, and every share helps us continue bringing meaningful stories to people around the world. Together, we can create a space where respect, compassion, and truth are more than ideals, they're lived realities. Thank you again from the bottom of our hearts.